Okay, so let's talk a bit about what we're going to cover today then after I tell you about my side hustle as a 70 plus run leader. So there's a few things that if you really want to everyday and mainstream your culture change into your existing processes and approaches, there's a few things that you need to think about. For me, the first is really about getting the basics in place. So we'll talk about the foundations that allow you to know what you're aiming for, and therefore do those little tweaks and accommodations that allow you to drive things through. We'll then think a bit more about how we get the true basics in terms of change right around that and what that looks like. We'll discuss an approach for evaluating your current projects and considering how you then think about making the tweaks that you need to around those. And then we'll have a bigger conversation about taking action and what that needs to look like. So let's talk first of all about this piece around getting the basics in place. So one of the big barriers that I see to people really being able to actively engage and influence and purposely cultivate their culture through a day-to-day basis is actually having a clear and concrete view of what that ideal vision needs to look like. Often when I talk to organisations, whether it's the leadership, whether it's the HR SLT, and even when we're consciously in a vision setting conversation, where people often are is telling me the things that are wrong and they don't want to happen anymore from a behavioural or an attitudinal perspective within their business. They're not necessarily talking about, well, if I dare to dream, what does the future actually look like? So an important piece of being able to cultivate your culture is actually really being able to clearly articulate and define what a great culture looks like for you, and being able to connect that not just to the grumbles of, well, you know, when I give somebody a project that never gets finished, or as soon as they hit a barrier, they never do it. So great culture for us is more accountability, you know, total fix and grumble led approach. It's more about, well, where are we going in the future? What are our strategic goals? What are our objectives? What is it that we truly want this department or this business to achieve? And how does it need to feel around here? And how do people need to act in order for us to achieve those objectives? And from that, we're able to say, well, this is the culture that we need to create in order to foster that experience and enable those behaviours that we need. So it is important to understand the pieces that we might want to shift and avoid and learn the lessons from the past. But if we get caught too much in the past, all we're really trying to do is plaster over the cracks in the wall, rather than actually thinking about maybe we need to knock this building down and build a whole other one that's really more interesting and useful and fit for purpose. So we limit what our capacity is if we don't really drive that vision for the future. So I'm going to give you a minute to have a think about this for your context. So I'm just going to ask you all to imagine it's, let's say, 3 years' time from today, and you've gone through the same routine as you did this morning, and you've got the same day ahead as you do today, but you feel really great about it because it feels to you like the people around you are all aligned and connected to doing the same thing. They seem to be valuing the same stuff, and their behaviours are really on point in terms of really delivering the goals that you have together in terms of working. So your culture is really supporting people to feel excited, connected, and like they've got it in their gift to deliver whatever they need to, and they're supported and safe to do that. So I want you to have a think about that world and just look around you and make a note for yourself of, how does it feel? How do people feel? How are they behaving? And what is it that they're proud of or they really value about your organisation? So I'm just going to ask you to take a minute to have a think about that. How do they feel? How are they behaving? And if you were asking them what it was that they really valued about your business, what is it they would say? Okay. And then have a look at what you've written And just challenge yourself about where your mindset is at the moment. When you look at that, is that vision truly about the future? When you look at the characteristics or the descriptors that you've put down there, do they look at things that will enable and really deliver success for the future within your business? Or do they focus on the things that frustrate you and need to fix? Have you got the balance right around that? Or do you need to put your positive pants on and think about what could it be if we broke through some of that annoying stuff to make it happen? So in defining our vision, there's two things for me that vision setting is about when it comes to culture change. One is this piece about what is our ultimate destination? What is it that we're truly trying to grow towards and build and cultivate over time? What will we want to protect once we get there and really make sure that we foster? And in understanding that and ensuring that we're building that in I guess, a collegiate way that's about really understanding what is it that we're trying to be, what is it that our core purpose, our core value as a department or a vision or a department or a business is, and what does that mean in terms of the types of talent that we need and how they need to feel and behave to really deliver. We've got to make sure that it's concrete, it's anchored, it's not just kind of initial instinct led, because that will lead to the fixed piece. That's an important element of it. But I think if we're really starting to think about this piece around mainstreaming change and not making it feel like an overwhelming priority that we just can't seem to get the time of, we've got to also think about what our ideal role is and who we want to be within that change. Because often, again, when I'm working with businesses that are really stuck, what I find is that HR have been positioned into one of two roles. The one-man band, so culture's your thing, you write the theme tune, you sing the theme tune, and you're responsible for every element associated with it, you know, from the Christmas party to the employee voice programme to every single report that you get that, you know, Barbara's cooking fish in the microwave again and it's not acceptable and you've got to deal with it. You know, all of those pieces are there. And that is overwhelming because you are responsible for too many things, and particularly responsible for things that are not your responsibility and you can't really influence truly. So often there is a challenge that comes if we're stuck in that role of trying to be all things to everyone. And whenever we try to push forward with culture change in our search for our quest for momentum, what we can do is fill the gap that other people don't fill and accidentally put ourselves into that position of being the owner of everything around stuff. So understanding that role, understanding that risk, and just knowing where we are is helpful. The second role that I often see is that kind of police person. So the person whose job it seems to be the reminder of what appropriate behaviour, appropriate experiences looks like, the conscience of the leadership team, trying to remind them of the people aspects of the decisions that they're making, etc., without there being a natural consideration of that. Or, as I kind of mentioned in that one-man band piece, that responsibility for seeming to be the person who's got to hold others responsible if they fall out of the bounds of what seems to be acceptable behaviour, and always having to be the one who pulls people aside to have the quiet conversations about behaviour instead of that being done as part of the day-to-day performance and management conversations. The third role is often that of the guide. So the individual who understands the route, is going with people on the journey. And often I see this role works particularly well in the fledgling stages of change, where if we can resist getting ourselves into that one-man band mode, what we can actually do is really support by helping create the route of where we need to go and supporting people up the mountain at a pace that actually works for them. So being that guide, that person who points and directs people, is helpful. But I think when you're really thinking about mainstreaming change and making it part of the day-to-day, the goal has got to be being the conductor of change. So you might not even write the sheet music. You know, what you want to find is that as an organization, you're defining what that ideal goal for your culture looks like. You're agreeing the priorities and the route to change together, because you've created that capability for understanding what the mechanisms for change are and what the key levers for change are within your context to help build that prioritization. But you are keeping the beat of the drum. You are making sure that all of the parts are working together and it's adding up to a sum that the individual parts couldn't create by themselves. So understanding where we are at the moment and what your ideal role will be through the course of your change is quite important, because that really helps when we're starting to evaluate our projects around, are we unconsciously putting ourselves into a position of a role that's unhelpful to really activate broader change, or are we actually building a path towards being that conductor of the orchestra, if that's our ultimate goal? So in understanding these two elements, having some of these conversations, building that model for change, building that model for culture cultivation within our business, what we're then able to do is really start to articulate that quite clearly. Now, I know at this stage you'll be saying, well, Polly, you said I could just do this every day, and this seems like a lot of work in terms of going to do a load of vision setting and role modelling, or, you know, modelling on change models, etc. But what I would say to you that is, with this foundation, a really clear contract with your business around, this is where we're going, this is the roles that we're working to have, and this is the journey that we're going to take over time to get there, you're much more likely then to create sense and context for the day-to-day HR project work that you're doing, which makes it easier to sell the dips, the adjustments or the alignments that you might make to make sure that works through. And a prime example I would use is I was working with an organisation doing this bit of work last week, and we were talking about the challenges of scoping and selling a leadership development programme. So the head of talent absolutely knows that the leadership team isn't quite where they need to be in terms of capability of leading the business forward. She's currently trying to do a data needs analysis to build a leadership development programme, but she's hitting quite a bit of defensiveness and unsurety from the leadership around it. And we talked about how, with a clear vision for the future of Ideal Culture, actually your leadership development program starts to drop out of that, and you're selling the content of that as a build to the future, not a, well, these are the 6 things that I need to tell you you're terrible at to try and convince you to engage with me on this program. So having this in place gives you that positive shared contract for the future that allows you to anchor and inform a lot of the work that you're doing, making a lot of the initial prep work that you might normally do around that a lot less than it would need to be. So it is a bit of extra work up front, but if we work out the overall equation, it's about the same, I promise, and then it gives you the foundations that you need. In considering this, though, you'll notice that I've talked about a few things here. You know, that evolution role, that evolving role of HR. I've also talked about that evolving kind of definition of what ideal looks like, and supporting people to move from that fix into that positive build mentality. And the reason that I focused on that is, whenever we're considering our culture change, for me, there's 2 elements that are really important when we're considering how we might shift or align our culture change into our projects. One is about the change itself, which is often where we rush to in order to deliver things, you know, thinking about, well, I need to increase accountability or personal agency, or I need to increase connection or capacity to have courageous conversations. So we focus on little micro pockets of the culture and think, I need to shift that behaviour. And then we do a training programme or a comms programme or something to try and move that. And then we find that we're frustrated because actually the behaviour just falls back to where it's always been. And often that's because we forget about this piece that's around readiness to change, and actually thinking about, how do we prepare our population to really be able to engage with us in a way that means that they can take that training, that development, those comms messages in a way that's truly going to feel relevant and useful to them, and they're going to be able to move that forward. So considering readiness to change, and I'll share a model with you in a minute around that in terms of looking at how we define your distance to travel, so that you can start to think about actually how you play that through projects is quite important. So considering readiness to change and defining the change itself is important. And for us, when you're working through the change, there's really 4 key stages that we think about within this, and we're going to explore these as part of your everyday activity in a minute. So that piece around co-creating and then launching, or to some extent launching your culture playbook, I think is massively important. And no bones about it, it's a bit of initial extra effort to drive through. You can do a quick and dirty version of this to get yourself started in terms of really understanding what the next year or the next 1 to 2 years might look like. It doesn't have to be a huge kind of consultation and massive piece of work, but the better or the clearer you can define that and create your ideal goal as a consistent point at the start of a process, the more likely it is that you can reinforce that and support that as you go. We then really encourage you to think about, well, where are we at the moment? What's our current state in terms of building that context about what's the distance that we need to travel? And we do that through a few things. I'll share with you in a bit our Cultural Catalyst Scorecard, which looks at some of those systemic factors that might influence things. And they allow you to start to think about, well, what's the stuff within our system that might be unconsciously encouraging people to behave in a certain way? How do we unpick it? And I think personal responsibility is a perfect example of this, where I'll go into organizations a lot of the time and the exec will be grumbling about the fact that people just don't do what they need to. We try to empower them, but they're always escalating issues up. Or you should see the board papers that we get that we have to read that just shouldn't be anywhere near us. And you start to have conversations about, well, what do you do when you get those board papers? Do you read them and respond to them, or do you send them back with feedback that that's someone else's remit? What do your budget lines, your delegated authority lines look like? What happens whenever somebody makes an incorrect decision? How is that responded to? So understanding the elements behind the ecosystem that have got to the point that people are escalating issues or feel unable to drive personal responsibility are going to be the mechanisms of change that you're going to unpick to allow that behaviour to shift. Just doing some training around how you take personal responsibility, or models of problem solving, or things like that, or even doing some training around psychological safety with managers. If the system isn't enabling that sense of trust and psychological safety, it doesn't really matter what you do with managers, because that's words, and the system is telling them action-wise what the norms are that people should work to. And the other element that we think about as well is kind of this piece around really understanding where the drags might be for you, whether that's in teams or specific behaviours that are really ingrained, really systemic, and are going to be difficult to unpick, and understanding those. So I'm just telling you this because I think this gives a bit of context about how we then start to approach tweaking some of those everyday projects. So what I'm not suggesting is that, I say to you today, let's everyday this, and then say, well, actually run this process. But if you think that if your goal is to make these 4 things happen across the change itself, once you've built that piece of readiness, or those 2 pieces are typically happening beside each other, then we can start to consider how, when we're looking at our reward updates, our reward project to update our rewards and benefits, we might think about how some of those elements within our ecosystem might need to shift, or we might want to take a tribe approach to really driving that and enabling it to make sure that we get what we need. So understanding those basics can be helpful. So to understand the distance to travel, we've got to be able to understand the readiness to change for our population. And we think about this across 4 elements. And this is a really helpful way to start to think about how you might mainstream some of these elements, really. So do people have any awareness or understanding that your culture could do with a tweak or an evolve or a shift? Do they recognise that? Is the definition of the culture one that makes it a bit of a sacred cow, or do people understand that there might be some requirement for things to shift? But also, are they in a place where they can take this build and positively reference mentality that's allowed them to move things forward? Mindset for us is really about that base understanding, not just that change needs to happen, which is often something that people do come with, but that I need to change for this culture to shift. So that recognition that it's not just everybody else around the table that needs to do something differently, but actually I understand what my role in driving our positive culture is and changing that, but also then in protecting and fostering it moving forward. And I understand that I might have to do some things differently. So that piece around mindset and recognizing that there's going to be a disruption and a challenge of norms and a self-review and evaluation to allow us to really fulfill that role is important. And often that's one of the most challenging areas to move people through, because they'll be very keen to focus on what other people in the ecosystem need to do, and they struggle more to focus on their on themselves. Now, for us, that's one of the reasons that taking a build mentality is important, because when we're taking a fixed mentality, we bring people into a defensive mindset where they will just focus to move blame into other areas if we're looking back and just looking at the issues that need to be fixed. If we create a build mindset, we're creating a much more positively open, kind of motivated and psychologically safe environment for people to start to think about, well, yeah, of course, it's totally predictable that we would be where we are now. How do we move forward? So try and create a neutral, blame-free piece. Capability is massively important. So do people have the capacity that they need, the skills, the understanding to drive that forward? And then the other piece, which is massively important, is around opportunity to actually do something different. And some of this relates to those systems and processes and how we unpick things to move things forward. So typically what we'll do is have a look at what's going on within our populations. You'll know yours because you're in it and you're working with them already, and start to consider how the work that we're doing on a day-to-day basis helps us to shift people across each of these areas to allow us to get to a place where they're really supporting us and enacting the change. Well, think about where the current culture is at the minute and how close is that to your ideal vision. And this tool, if you're interested in understanding yours, our EX Index is a free dick test tool that just allows you to see where your current culture sits against some current pillars. So I'll pop the link, I'll send a follow-up out with a link to this session, the recording, but I'll pop a link to that into it as well, because that will help you to start to see, well, where are we at the moment? And across these factors, are they enabling the experience that we need, or are they creating something different? And it can help you start to have some of the conversation about overplayed strengths in our culture. So again, just from an example with a client last week who has a really collegiate, friendly, supportive culture, but as we dug into the current culture definition, what was clear was that high support, high connection, family-based culture was a real overplayed strength, and it was starting to undermine some behaviours around accountability and drive. Everything had become quite cosy and comfortable for them. So some of the conversation that we're having is, you don't want to get rid of those elements, but what you want to make sure is that we are using those elements to their best effect to drive the culture forward, and we're dialing back where we might be overplaying those strengths, and they could be risking actually undermining other elements, behavioural elements that we need in order to drive the business forward. So the way that this report works is it will give you a sense of to what extreme your culture sits on each of these areas, tell you what the strength is, but also what the risks are in terms of overplayed strengths, which can support you in having some of that conversation, but also thinking about how you influence the projects and the work that you're doing to create a narrative that fits with your organisation. Now, I'll not spend too much time on this. I've mentioned this already, but our cultural catalyst scorecard really represents this idea of understanding your ecosystem and getting out of the habit that we see in some businesses of thinking that individuals' behaviour is purely down to the individuals, and therefore we've got to train or educate that behaviour out of them, but looking to think about a more systemic and holistic approach to understanding the overall ecosystem that people are working within. So we find this a really useful way to evaluate our current context in terms of how well is that pointed towards our ideal future. So basically what we do with this is just rag rate it against that future vision and say, so to what extent are our authority and decision making levels, I'm obsessed with delegated authority today, aren't I? But to what extent are our authority and decision making levels really enabling people to take personal responsibility and act with personal agency within our organisation? And so with that ideal culture as our kind of benchmark, we're able to really look at our system and think, is there anything here that we need to unpick and adapt? What I've done as a takeaway is just share some questions that you can use to do some of this evaluation, as in depth or as light touch as feels appropriate for you in your context to allow you to look through. So 2 basic foundations that you need to work through in order to drive it. So sorry, first 30 minutes of talking about everydaying this is about trying to convince you to do some other bits, but you've got to have the foundations in place. Know what your ideal culture is, what you're aiming for, understand that distance to travel, both in terms of readiness to change and readiness to really enact and be an owner of culture across the different groups that you've got, but also then from a cultural point of view, understand your organisational ecosystem and what might need to shift to allow you to really enable that system to create that ultimate impact for you. Those two pieces are important. Otherwise, we're just guessing and fixing when we start to try and drive our that evaluation of our current projects. And in looking at current projects, often what we do is talk to people about the natural cycle, I guess, in which projects are often built. So we will often use the employee life cycle to map out where your projects sit, and also to talk a bit about how does that ideal vision of your culture play out in terms of ideal experience across these 5 core areas. And in doing that, you start to create that standard in terms of the ultimate outcome that you're trying to drive with any project that you're using. So we've got to create some sort of basis to localize our evaluation and not try and make every single project try and create every single piece of change that we want within our culture. So you can use the employee life cycle to start to bring that down into what does ideal experience look like. So then that allows us to tailor our projects. But also what we can start to do is actually really critically evaluate our projects across the outcomes that they're driving in the context of our ideal culture. So you can see as you look at this why that definition of ideal culture is important as a starting point. So this is a core piece of activity that I find really activates HR teams to start to think about where's the quick wins, the connections that we might be able to drive forward. So you can read this yourself, but you'll see that basically what we do is just look at the current, what are our current projects, what are the planned outcomes, or what's the intended outcomes that we've been working towards for those. Now let's evaluate those current projects and the planned outcomes of them against our vision for our ideal culture, and start to RAG rate, or number them as we do from a 1 to 3 in terms of how aligned or not are they to our current vision. Thinking about, are people ready enough for them? But also, are they actually encouraging the right type of behaviour? So is my role in this project one that is allowing me to move a bit closer to my ideal role of guide or conductor, or am I accidentally in living in the one-man band space? Are the behaviours that we're encouraging or the outcomes that we're trying to drive, are they aligned with the behavioural standards and vision that we're creating within our ideal culture definition? So understanding that can be helpful. Sometimes the question is even just the pace that we're trying to drive on this. So again, a conversation I had earlier this week with someone around their DE&I agenda. So the individual has a goal for within their the head of ED&I within the organisation that I'm working with. And as we talked about this, she kind of said, my goal for next year is to do this, this, and this, and implement this, this, and this training for this outcome. But as we talk about this and I think about readiness, I realise actually that that's my ultimate goal for my strategy. And if I go too hard or too quick on that, it's probably going to fail and it's not going to connect in the way that I need to. So currently, I'm setting myself an objective of getting to 100% of delivery of my goals around this priority. But when I think about readiness, you know what? I think actually I need to get to 30% and I need to do a chunk of work that's around the narrative of this and why it's important and linking it to the evolution of what we're doing with our overall culture and our broader 5-year business strategy to help people understand that this isn't just an agenda for the business, but it's a core lever for business success moving forward. So the outcome in terms of thinking about what could unlock additional value for you won't always necessarily be, well, we'll do a bit more or we'll shift it in this way. It might be, you know what, we're going to slow this down and we're going to focus a little bit more on awareness and mindset before we really get into that capability build on that priority. Or actually, I noticed that over there, talent is already doing some work on leadership and management development. So maybe what we'll do is put that piece around the ED&I. I don't know why I'm mixing the letters around today, but the ED&I agenda. Do you know what? I think actually we might put that into the management development program that we're building, because that will create a context of that overall responsibility for managing for employee experience and our positive culture, rather than it sitting as a separate piece. So it can be that we're creating cross-pollination and connections that unlock the additional power. It isn't always about doing some additional work. So I would really encourage you on an individual basis to be looking at each of your projects, thinking about this extent of alignment to our vision, but then also considering, given the readiness and given the cultural levers and systems that we've got in place, has what I've got planned, is it actually likely to have the impact that I want it to? Or do I risk hitting that position that we've all been in, where we think, well, we you know, you can't take a horse to water. You can take a horse to water, but you can't make it drink, you know, but we haven't checked actually that the horse's head can reach the water because it's a bit dipped down from the riverbed. You know, understanding some of those mechanics that make it more likely that the horse is going to drink that water can be really helpful to really supercharge what we're doing around things. The other thing I would encourage around this is thinking about team alignment as well. So not only doing this on an individual perspective, but also thinking about how you connect in with your team and look at that. So I think that example of the kind of what was, until we did our kind of quick win and integration session with that HR team against their current vision, what were two very separate agendas that were sitting within the people strategy but under other individuals, suddenly started to intertwine and become connected in a way that really would deliver much better value around things. So understanding that, I think, is really helpful. And I'll give you just a few actions that I find are very, oh goodness, sorry, there's a lot of words on this one, isn't there? But I'll give you a few actions that I find are quite common when we host these sessions with HR leadership teams, to really think about what it might look like. So leadership development, as I mentioned, often it reduces the need for that individual definition and needs analysis, because we can do that against the ideal culture and benchmark. We're benchmarking current capability against the ideal culture rather than trying to dream something up and sell it through. Often we find that there's a piece that comes in with the internal comms, which is thinking about the strategic narrative around what we're doing. So how do we connect up the different bits of work that we're doing and make sure that we show how they make sense to both the business or your department strategy, and how that links to ideal culture and experience. So that piece around really understanding, why is this important and what outcomes is it supposed to drive, not just from a people point of view, or this program will say it's a development program, these are the learning outcomes that you'll get. It's that next piece of influence that's around, and this is what it'll enable in the business, and this is why it's important in terms of the burning platforms or the burning opportunities that are clear within our business to allow us to succeed. So that piece around wraparound and true strategic comms is really important, and is something that we see commonly gets missed, because the comms team often don't sit within our team, but pulling that support and that connectioning can be really helpful. I've already mentioned the example of the ED&I training that kind of worked through again with me on Monday of this week. I think the reward strategy is similar. So if you know what your ideal behaviours are, then you're much more likely to see where you might, if you want to review the awards that you're providing, making sure that actually they are aligned to the ideal behaviours. So, the Go Above and Beyond award is so common. When I worked in wellbeing, it was amazing how many businesses said, I don't really understand why people are stressed, and they always feel like they need to do more than we ask them to. We tell them to slow down or etc., or be more realistic and not over deliver. But then the first reward or the first employee award that happened every year was the Go Above and Beyond award. So recognizing how we accidentally lift and promote certain behaviors and thinking about how we align to what our key behaviors are is quite important. Also, I think employee voice, our employee surveys or voice strategy are ones that are really interesting, because how we respond to, how we ask for feedback from people, but then how we respond to that feedback tells people a huge amount about what our attitude is to their views, but also who we think owns the solutions around things. And a prime example on this that I use a huge amount, so forgive me if you've heard me talk about this one previously, is the You Said We Did model that comes from survey feedback. feedback that seems to have nudged itself into best practice around, well, make sure you tell people. But if you think about it, it creates a true parent-child dynamic with individuals of, it's your job to tell me what the problem is, and then I will fix it for you. And often when I'm working with organisations on their ideation and action planning associated with their employee voice strategy, we talk actually about that data being a starting point for team-based ideation and activation, and then feeding up bids for support that leadership then talk about and feed back on, but we don't keep that central comms and connection around things. Now, there's sticky stuff that we need to unpick around that. Don't get me wrong, I know in terms of making sure that there is an organisational position and an organisational response, but ensuring that we think about things almost in terms of what do individuals need to do and being able to enact on these results, what do teams need to do, and then what does the organisation need to do, and really separating that to show those different roles and responsibilities is a really great way of unpicking those really unconscious signals that we can give. That is, my job is to make you happy, and you tell me the things that make you mad, and I try and fix some of those, typically not by doing the things that you actually need me to do a lot of the time. So understanding where we are unconsciously sending those messages is useful, and I think employee voice strategy is a really lovely quiet Trojan horse that we can use to start to activate new behaviours around colleague-based ideation, action planning sprints that are localised and really supported by the business to make something different, but aren't running that you said we did piece around things. And then also thinking about stuff like, your OD and operating model review, making sure that the underlying principles that you're putting in place, the spans of control that you're creating, the delegated authority lines around that reflect the levels of leadership control, empowerment, etc., that you want to have in place. So in understanding how you want it to feel, you can start to think about how you tweak your organisational structure or take advantage of the tweaks that you're doing to make sure that it influences that. Okay, so she'll take a breath because there's quite a bit in there, isn't there? I'm interested in your thoughts, observations. Where does that take people when you read that as a starter for 10? What's your thoughts? Anybody got any questions or comments at all?
I think it's good to have a framework where you can see, because I think a lot of people, a lot of businesses start on a journey of change, but they're not always sure what they want the outcome to be, and kind of get lost along the way. So I think a structure around it is really useful, and an opportunity to constantly review where you are, because you might start out with a plan, but that plan needs to change based on different dynamics and things that have gone on. So having a framework and a structure behind it is super helpful.
Thanks, Tracy. I totally agree. Hazel and I had a call this morning, actually, didn't we, Hazel? And said exactly that. Culture change is not a destination. It's Hazel used the beautiful phrase of a journey of becoming. It's got to be a constant iteration and evolution, because we're working with people and living systems, and we don't really know how they will. We can use the research to predict how people might respond to the different things that we do, but we can't know for sure. So continuing to check, review, refocus is massively important. Thank you so much for that. Mark, go ahead.
Thanks very much for that, Paul. A really interesting presentation. Just on the you said we did for employee surveys, that's something that I would totally endorse, totally agree with. That parent-child dynamic that it creates, that allows an opportunity for people to sort of kind of lob problems at the senior leadership team, or for HR or the survey owner to have to sort of kind of try and bat away and deal with. And what I always say is that that sort of kind of survey or any employee voice tool is not an auditor's report that we need to respond to. It's an intelligence tool that we all use to shape whatever we're doing, lots of which might well be ongoing activity, so not necessarily just something that you do something new about. And just lastly around that, I'm in a fairly new civil service department. We've got a lot of colleagues who've came from other civil service departments. There's a lot of cynicism around you said we did, around how 2 weeks before the survey launches, there's a flurry of you said we did notice boards and posters going up, and it's basically just a sort of kind of tool to try and sort of kind of generate a higher response rate. And then there's there's a lot of activity when the survey results come out, typically in November for us, but then there's a kind of radio silence for 9 months of the year, So yeah, I would totally agree with all of that.
Lovely, thank you. And it's kind of inevitable, isn't it? If you put the ownership at leadership, but there's no accountability on things, then it will fall away, because there's, there is so much on everyone's agenda that they do the things that they're accountable for. So if you can share responsibility for it and drive a bit more accountability, then you're much more likely to get consistent action. So thank you for that. I appreciate the reflections. Hazel, go ahead.
Yeah, can you hear me now? I know we had trouble.
Yeah.
Awesome. No, I really liked the holistic approach that you take to sort of that internal evaluation against that sort of tangible vision, which is the basics that you put in place. I'm really curious about your experience and the group's experience of how you've also leveraged benchmarking and sort of discovery compared to sort of external organisations, which may be in like competitors who may not be, or whether how you use that can also be a catalyst to move further faster.
Yeah. Well, I've got a quite a strong view on that. I'm interested if anyone else has got any experiences before I share. What's other people's thoughts on external benchmarking and how you use it? Any experiences? So, well, I'll share my experience. If I'm, and so full disclosure, my experience comes from having spent kind of 5 years working for a large survey company, leading their consultancy function, where benchmarking was one of the most important elements, the kind of USP, I guess, on that, in terms of being able to norm and compare your data to other contexts. My lived experience of it, and this isn't research based, so I'll be completely honest of it, is that I find that I don't always find benchmarking that helpful, in all honesty, because organisations get safety on the areas that they align with, and they fixate on the places that they fall behind. And often, actually, when they're benchmarking, it'll be with organisations with different contexts, different drivers, different populations, talent profiles, etc. And so they get distracted by trying to hit that benchmark rather than looking at what their own standard is in terms of that ideal culture. So I find it much more productive over the years to really think about what does good look like for us. If we understand the definition of our ideal culture, how do we translate that into our own internal benchmarks and our own internal goals, and how does that keep us laser focused on where we want to go? Like, where you can find comparable, I know you've worked in the NHS and retail, etc. in the past, so big sectors that will have similar populations, similar contexts. I think it does work better, but in a lot of businesses I see leadership teams using that as a way to feel safe, that we either don't have to do too much or we can just focus on this thing rather than necessarily thinking about the whole story. But it sounds to me like you've had a different experience, so I'd love to hear what your thoughts are and how you've used them. What's your kind of experience of it?
Yeah, no, I really loved how you responded, because to be honest, I'm quite aligned, and I've always challenged that point of view. Are we comparing apples with pears? Given that our context, while we look and smell the same, actually our contexts are really different. And when you get down to actual benchmarks, who are you really competing with? And I really loved how you said, well, actually, we're really competing with ourselves rather than with others. Who can be the best for ourselves and our customers, then we're winning. Rather than let's compare ourselves to somebody else who may be seemingly winning in the market that we're playing in, but actually what are they winning on? And I think the other part for me, which has been super valuable, is just the catalyst of like not pure benchmarking, but actually doing external discovery about what does good look like elsewhere. Could we adapt and adopt that here? How might that work here to move us further, faster? If we hadn't have lifted our heads up, because quite often we get obsessed with the internal evaluation, which can often compound where we are, rather than taking a look up, taking a breath and feel inspired by new innovations from elsewhere. Everybody doesn't have pots of money to throw at that kind of stuff. Certainly my experience in the NHS was, but in stark comparison, I also have experience of working in Walmart, where they did have pots of money to throw at things like that, but would also invest in sort of their own sort of design to sort of, well, we've got a good idea of that, but Walmart can create it for itself.
Yeah.
Which was a really interesting dynamic. But I think what my experience of working in the people function with them, people strategy team, was actually we were really good and developed that discipline to both look inwards but look outwards, to get that outside in view as well, to create that spark of inspiration.
Yeah, and you know, I think that's so important, and it really timely actually. I was listening, I had a lot of time in the car yesterday between meetings, and I was listening to a podcast on creativity, and one of the podcast host had a researcher on creativity and basically they were saying that for them, that, you know, the research that they've done suggests that the best having the most amount of ideas and most high quality of ideas happens whenever you don't just sit down and say, let's throw everything out and try and figure this out, but actually you send the ideation group away to have a look at where those things have where other industries, other contexts, etc., have solved a similar problem, and you bring all of those different methodologies, approaches back to the table, and then talk about, well, can we be inspired by this and use it? And used a really, like, feels like a silly example, but it's genius, where the inventor of Velcro created it because they noticed the little seeds sticking on their dog's hair, and they were like, maybe I could recreate that sense of barb and fur in real life. And so they were totally inspired by a real life situation where that mechanism was happening, and then they created, you know, a product that's a staple across the world, really. So this idea of understanding what other people are doing, even if it's not, you know, I think often we have this obsession of, let's see what our people in our sector are doing, how have they solved it? But, you know, certainly in building my approach to culture change, I've looked at marketing and how that's applied things like behavioural science, agile methodology, and what's tech doing with that. You know, how do we apply systems thinking? Bringing all of those things together is what's created the solution, not just me going, oh, well, what's the 47 things that I think about culture, because I've worked in this in a while, really, because it doesn't, you know, the inspiration has happened and been tested in other places. Thank you for that. Any other questions, comments? So just a couple of final thoughts from, go ahead, Hazel. Yeah, go ahead.
You just sparked a thought for me. I was thinking about how do we borrow the lessons from customer experience as well,
yes,
and overlay that into sort of people experience, you know, because we also run the risk of invention for problems that don't exist.
Yeah.
How do we use data and insights and, you know, test that out with real people? You know, they're there, we're employing them. So how can we build a relationship to sort of like meet their needs?
Yeah.
So, you know, that's difficult when you're working in a really, really large organization, and it's not about necessarily going down to individual or personalization, but also you don't want to go to the other extreme of creating vanilla solutions to real problems as well. So that's my only point. Thank you.
No, I appreciate that. So I guess just kind of as a final takeaway before, you know, you will escape on to your next Teams meeting. For me, if you're thinking about action, really encourage this piece around, you know, understand that we need that standard to be able to truly engage and bring this method to its full value. But doing that individual evaluation is critical. Looking at our projects, readiness, and is it really in enabling the types of behaviours and the types of context and elements of the organisational system that we want to create to drive our organisational culture is important. That piece around connection and alignment is important. Am I talking to my colleagues who are managing other parts of the employee life cycle or doing other elements? Are we bringing this together and making sure that it adds up to more than the individual streams and creating something that is greater than the sum of its parts? But then also, how do we actually filter this? Because there'll be lots of things that we want to do, and this is, you know, a really little technique, but this piece around consciously breaking down what I must do, should do, or could do, doing our must do first, and then starting to evaluate our should and could do's as we work through is useful. I find time and time again when we try to evaluate what will we do and what will we not do, everything just stays in the will we do pile. So here we're just doing a little psychological trick of saying, well, we'll get to all of it eventually, and we're just keeping it all in the buckets, but let's start to prioritize it in an order that makes it realistic that we're doing the things that bring the biggest bang for our investment and our time, when none of us are time rich or resource rich in these contexts. And the last thing I would just say is if you want to continue to develop your skills on this, if you're interested in this conversation, we've got a free community called Spark, which has a, I'm trying to remember how often, a 2-weekly newsletter, series of blogs, but you get first dibs on these webinars, etc. And we're looking to set up a practitioner webinar at the start of next year, which is sharing experiences and bringing case studies from the sector around. And the other thing to make you aware of is that we're just about to launch our Culture Change Makers Accelerator course, which will be happening through November and the start of December. It's a 6-week course pulling all things system thinking, mass behaviour change and agile methodology together, and an idea of just giving you an explosion of ideas to really make you feel like you've got the breadth of techniques and resources that you need to drive culture within your own area. This is the first time that we're running this course. No big sell, just a complete statement of fact. We're doing champagne content, she says, setting herself up for a challenge, on a lemonade budget. So we're doing it on an introductory budget because it really is a pilot on things. So I'll send some details out about that when it comes. But if you're interested, we'd love to keep you as part of the community, because we really want to drive a revolution around this in terms of creating great environments for people. So thank you so much for today. I've really enjoyed talking to you. Thank you for the comments and the observations. And yeah, if anybody wants to continue the conversation, we'd love to see you in Spark. Come and find me, and I'd be really happy to talk about it all.